Greetings, folks, and welcome to what will probably be an unhappy little talk about substance abuse. As you probably notice as you make your way through Tenant of Wildfell Hall, this is one of Anne Bronte's major concerns. And of course, she's not the only Bronte sister who has this concern. Both Charlotte and Emily addressed the issue as well. Charlotte in Jane Eyre with John Reed, and Emily, much more dramatically, in Wuthering Heights with Hindley. But I think it's with Anne that the theme gets its most thorough treatment, in the character of Arthur Huntingdon, and also in the novel's explicit discourse on alcohol that we encounter as we move through it. In all three cases, the real-life example of the person ruining himself through drink is, of course, the Bronte's brother Branwell, which is why I've titled this talk Branwell's Ghost. I think a good way into this topic, though, considering that this is a course on authors and movements, is to talk a little bit about the Temperance Movement itself. And to do that, we need to talk a little bit first about what the alcohol culture was like in early 19th century England. Social alcohol consumption, of course, has a history going back millennia as far as the written records reach, actually, and pretty certainly a good deal farther than that. But of course, every culture has its own approach to that particular substance and to other intoxicants as well. Some drink more, some drink less, and in terms of overall alcohol consumption, in 18th and 19th century Britain, people drank a lot. And by a lot, I mean a whole lot more than they drink now. And this, of course, was true on both sides of the Atlantic. In the time period we're referring to, though, there are some specific factors that we do need to consider. One, which doesn't really touch upon the novels we're looking at, is social class. But as this is part of the fabric of the society into which the Brontes are writing, I think it's also worth taking a moment on here, as social class is intimately bound up in the temperance movement as a whole. And when we look at class, the first thing we need to consider, of course, is the Industrial Revolution. This had, by the time we're discussing, already transformed much of Victorian society, or pre-Victorian society, because, of course, this goes back to the 18th century. With the rise of industrialism, of factory labor, we also saw the rise of industrial slums and the kind of misery that's associated with industrial slums, unregulated as far as sanitation and construction standards are concerned, combined with what we would now consider insane working hours. 16 hours a day, 6 days a week were not uncommon. And very low wages, poverty-level wages, where even working those hours, people struggled to keep roofs over their heads and often still could not feed their children. So we're looking at a large segment of the population living in quite genuine misery. Throw into this mix the fact that though distilling had been around for quite some time, the Romans did it. Access to cheap gin was relatively new. That is, people could get their hands on very strong drink for relatively little money. And they often did, for the very simple reason that they were living in misery and, quite frankly, simply wanted to kill the pain of their own lives. Add to these circumstances the fact that alcohol production was largely unregulated at the time, and that the makers of the gin in question would sometimes add really, really nasty ingredients to enhance the flavor without really boosting the cost all that much. So, turpentine was not uncommon. So what people were drinking was really, really awful stuff. And as I think I mentioned in one of our discussions earlier this term, there was no legal limit to how strong the drink could be. So what we consider to be a very strong drink, 80 proof, 40% alcohol, was nowhere near as strong as the alcohol sometimes got in the distilled beverages of the time. The result, of course, was exactly what you'd expect when you have a large portion of the population suffering from a serious addiction. Money that was needed for rent, food, clothes went instead to alcohol. Family violence was very common, especially given that there were very few laws protecting the victims of family violence, such that women, and particularly children who often had two drunken parents, were living in some pretty horrendous circumstances that they often could see no way out of, and that in turn poisoned their own psyches and launched them on their own paths of abuse and addiction. But, as so often happens when the powers that be set up a system under which the poor suffer and then the poor show signs of suffering, the powers that be turn around and blame the poor for their suffering. And this is what happened in industrial England in ways that bear directly on the development of electoral politics. Because at the time, though Britain was a constitutional monarchy governed by a parliament, relatively few people had the right to vote. Certainly women didn't, and that wouldn't be fixed for a long time yet. But the majority of men also could not vote in Britain at the time. The electoral reforms of 1832 extended the franchise to the middle class by extending the vote to men who owned property. But the working class, who typically lived in rented accommodations, remained excluded. So, naturally, following the 1832 reforms, many in the working class began to agitate to also be included in the franchise. One of the results of this agitation was the movement known as Chartism, which emerged in 1836 with a document called the People's Charter, listing 6 goals aimed at more fully democratizing society. These were as follow. 1. A vote for all men over 21, not currently subject to punishment for committing a crime. 2. Secret ballot. 3. No property qualifications to become an MP. That is, they didn't want to just vote for the property owner who would then sort of represent them. They wanted to have the right to at least compete to represent themselves. 4. Payment for MPs. Up until that point, of course, being a member of Parliament was a non-paying gig, so only people who could afford to do it had the opportunity to serve in government. So the notion of salaries for MPs is another way of democratizing a parliamentary government, of course. 5, electoral districts of equal size here measured by population, such that the voters of any one district wouldn't be disproportionately represented and the voters of any other district disproportionately ignored. And 6, annual elections for the parliament. And while the Chartist movement would fizzle out in the 1840s, well before the voting reforms of 1867 and 1884, which resulted in universal male suffrage, they did bring a lot of important ideas to the table, and also, and this is why I bring them up in this talk, had a strong influence on the Temperance Movement. Here's why. Among the excuses offered by the upper and middle classes for continuing to deny the franchise to the working class, and I do need to be very clear that these were excuses, that is, post hoc rationalizations, not good faith reasons. But in any case, among the excuses that they gave were that the working class was incapable of governing itself, and therefore couldn't be trusted to take a hand in the government of the realm. And one of their principal arguments for this position was the rampant alcoholism in working class slums. For this reason, many working class voting advocates and activists aligned themselves with the temperance movement in order to lift that collective blemish off of the working class as a whole, to demonstrate to those with the power to pass legislation that would give them the right to vote that they were worthy of the right to vote. But what do we actually mean by temperance? This is a question that was in the process of being resolved when the Brontes were writing their novels. Initially, temperance does not mean abstinence. It means moderation. So the early decades of the temperance movement were aimed at not abolishing the drinking of alcohol or eliminating the drinking of alcohol from an individual life, but rather at encouraging self-restraint, at moderating consumption, and largely at moderating consumption by not drinking distilled spirits, but by drinking milder beverages such as wine and beer. And the reason here actually makes perfect sense. Wine and beer hit you more slowly, don't they? You get drunker faster on distilled spirits than you do on wine, beer, cider, etc. And the widespread availability of particularly cheap rot-gut gin had actually changed the character of public drunkenness in Britain and changed it much for the worse. So the temperance movement was aimed at eliminating that particular influence, or containing anyways, that particular influence, and mitigating the influence, mitigating the damage that alcohol was doing. Because, of course, many in the temperance movement still would enjoy a drink, and the taking of a glass or two of wine with dinner was actually not in the crosshairs of the early temperance activists. And to give you an indication of exactly what I mean, we should maybe take a look at the Beer House Act of 1830. Now, as for the Beer House Act and what it was, this is pretty simple. It gave permission for the payment of a licensing fee of 2 guineas, which at the time of the law's passage was £2 10 shillings, for any house, any place, to brew its own beer, wine, or cider on the premises, and of course to sell it. This law, with some modifications, remained on the books until 1993. Well, by the mid-19th century, there were some 24,000 registered beer houses, so this was sort of a heyday for what we now call microbreweries. But why enact the law in the first place? And there were 2 basic reasons. One was to not let surplus agricultural produce go to waste. That is, if you have more grain than you can sell, or more apples than you can sell, if you don't do something with them that's going to preserve them somehow, they're going to rot and you're going to lose your money and your work. Well, if you make them into beer, if you make them into cider, they keep for a long time and you can sell them. So it's a way of actually bolstering the economy, particularly of bolstering the rural economy where this stuff is grown. But also, and more importantly for our purposes, it was envisioned, the law itself, the act itself, was envisioned as a way of mitigating the damage being done by the consumption of spirits by steering people towards milder drinks. And the rhetoric around the act, the celebration of the drinking of beer and ale as particularly English, identified these beverages as sort of markers of nationality or nationalism, and attempted to, by almost a propaganda campaign, and I probably shouldn't even use the word almost, get people to voluntarily moderate their intake of alcohol by patriotically drinking beer and cider. The logic also of making these places so widely available was to combat what we've already identified as easy and cheap availability of strong and quite frankly corrosive gin. Gin here is the real enemy, or at least in the early years of the temperance movement it is. But as time passed, a different and more extreme or puritanical strain of temperance began to emerge, and this was the notion that one ought not to engage in any drinking of alcohol whatsoever. So there is a tension then, And this tension is in the process of being worked out, as I said, when the Brontes are writing their novels, between temperance as moderation and abstinence, what in the 1830s comes to be known as teetotalism. One of the principal activists here was Joseph Livesey of Preston, Lancashire, a working class man who became involved in local politics and ultimately became a quite influential publisher, writer, and philanthropist. Preston's position was simply that there should be no consumption of alcohol, that all alcohol consumption was deleterious, both personally and socially. He established in 1833 the Temperance Hotel, because of course hotels were places where one would notoriously go to drink. So this was a hotel that didn't offer that option. And from 1834 to 1837, published a periodical titled the Preston Temperance Advocate. What he advocated, among other things, was the pledge, which was something that you would actually sign to commit to complete abstinence from the consumption of alcohol. That is, to commit to teetotalism. And I should say something here about the spelling of teetotalism. I think this is sometimes given as TEA, totalism, like you only drink tea, which, is a very English thing to do, I suppose. But the term goes back to the 1830s, and the T, TEE, is an emphasis on the capital T of totalism. That is, you are capital T totally abstaining from the consumption of alcohol. Well, when we move from the mid-19th century and into the later 19th century and early 20th century, so well beyond the range of our current discussion, temperance and teetotalism come to be more or less synonymous. But that is a transformation that is happening during the Brontes' lifetimes. Now, as long as we're talking about Brontes, because, hey, that's actually what I'm being paid to do, Anne includes in Tenant of Wildfell Hall advocates of both the moderation and teetotalism interpretations of temperance. The advocate of moderation is the Rev Millward, and the advocate of teetotalism is, of course, Helen Graham. I'll talk more about them in a few minutes. But before we take a look at the book itself, it's probably a good idea to also take a few minutes addressing the social perceptions of alcoholism, of addiction in Bronte's society, because these also were undergoing transformation as she was writing her book, and she was very much aware of the conversation that was in the air. And this conversation was basically an argument between two contending positions. The notion that substance abuse, we'll say habitual drunkenness, is a habit, that is, a problem of the will over which one has control, or a disease, an addiction, over which one is not completely in control. The addiction model at the time was fairly new. The word alcoholic only dates to about 1789, according to Merriam-Webster. So when Anne's writing her book, round about 1847, this is still a relatively new idea. And of course, whether we see substance addiction, be it alcohol or another substance, as entirely a matter of the will or as a medical condition, as it's come to be recognized, has a huge impact on how we view the person suffering from the condition. That is, in the one case, it's completely self-inflicted, and the person bears sole responsibility, and in the other case, there's not that same radical responsibility. There's more room for, I think, compassion, for understanding, and less room for outright condemnation. This is the difference, of course, between taking pity on an addict, for example, an alcoholic, even if you have to distance yourself from them while their lives collapse around them, or simply saying, somewhat smugly, oh, he brought it on himself. And if you want a good example of that latter view, a person worth looking at is Jonathan Edwards, who, in 1754, published a work called Freedom of the Will, in which he has this to say, particularly regarding what he refers to as the habitual drunkard. When a drunkard has his liquor before him, he has to choose whether to drink or no. If he wills to drink, then drinking is the proper object of the act of his will, and drinking, on some account or other, now appears most agreeable to him, and suits him best. If he chooses to refrain, then refraining is the immediate object of his will, and is most pleasing to him. That is, for Edwards, it's simply a matter of deciding what you want to do, and then doing it, in which case you have total responsibility. He goes on, "It cannot truly be said, according to the ordinary usage of language, that a malicious man, let him be never so malicious, cannot hold his hand from striking, or that he is not able to show his neighbor kindness, or that a drunkard, let his appetite be never so strong, cannot keep the cup from his mouth. In the strictest propriety of speech, a man has a thing in his power, if he has it in his choice, or at his election. Therefore, in these things, to ascribe a non-performance to the want of power or ability is not just." That is, Edwards is subscribing to what we might call libertarian free will, in which we are completely, absolutely, and at all times in control of the actions we undertake by virtue of the choices we make regarding them. What he doesn't take into account, and this is only something that is emerging at the time that he's writing and really coming to be scientifically current during Bronte's lifetime, is the notion of a compulsion, an internal compulsion that one actually, after a point, does not have the power to resist. This is what addiction is. And whether you want to look at it physically or psychologically, and these two are not mutually exclusive, the addiction model of alcoholism recognizes the internal compulsion that many alcoholics and other addicts speak of when they refer to their particular substances, that they get this craving that builds and builds and builds, and ultimately they lose the internal struggle to resist it. Now, from a merely abstract philosophic point of view, you might be able to still say, well, you still made your choice, but that doesn't track with the actual observations. And now that we, of course, have the ability to look at what the brain is doing and how closely our apparent choices relate to our actions, the choice model has less and less ground to stand on every year. But to go back to the Victorian period, as I said, this conversation was still in progress. It still is today, but it's more or less settled among people who actually study the question empirically. In the 19th century, though, there was still a big question of whether habitual drunkenness or addiction to other substances, and a big one here is laudanum, of course, which I'll talk about in a bit as well, was simply a failure of character or could be considered a medical condition. I'll leave it to you to decide which of these options best describes Anne's position. For now, I think it's probably a good idea to take a look at the text and see what it has to say for itself. But what does the novel actually have to say for itself? Well, there are a couple of passages that I'd like to take a look at, and they're not exactly short. Rather than looking at them piecemeal, though, I think it would be nice to have them at least mentally in front of us in something like their entirety before moving on to the discussion. So let's pick it up in chapter 3 with the invitation for Helen to attend the Guy Fawkes party on November 5th. "We're going to have a small party on Monday the 5th of November, said my mother, "and I hope you'll not refuse to make one, Mrs. Graham. You can bring your little boy with you, you know. I dare say we shall be able to amuse him, and then you can make your own apologies to the Millwards and Wilsons. They will all be here, I expect." "Thank you. I never go to parties." "Oh, but this will be quite a family concern. Early hours, and nobody here but ourselves, and just the Millwards and the Wilsons, most of whom you already know, and Mr. Lawrence, your landlord, whom you ought to make an acquaintance with." "I do know something of him, but you must excuse me this time, for the evenings now are dark and damp, and Arthur, I fear, is too delicate to risk exposure to their influence with impunity. We must defer the enjoyment of your hospitality till the return of longer days and warmer nights." Rose now, at a hint from my mother, produced a decanter of wine, with accompaniments of glasses and cake, from the cupboard and the oak sideboard, and the refreshment was duly presented to the guests. They both partook of the cake, but obstinately refused the wine, in spite of their hostess's hospitable attempts to force it upon them. Arthur especially shrank from the ruby nectar, as if in terror and disgust, and was ready to cry when urged to take it. "Never mind, Arthur," said his mamma. "Mrs. Markham thinks it will do you good, as you are tired with your walk, but she will not oblige you to take it. I dare say you will do very well without." "He detests the very sight of wine," she added, "and the smell of it almost makes him sick. I've been accustomed to make him swallow a little wine or weak spirits and water by way of medicine when he was sick, and, in fact, I have done what I could to make him hate them." Everybody laughed except the young widow and her son. "Well, Mrs. Graham," said my mother, wiping the tears of merriment from her bright blue eyes, "well, you surprised me. I really gave you credit for having more sense. The poor child will be the veriest milksop that ever was sopped. Only think what a man you'll be making of him if you persist in—" "I think it a very excellent plan," interrupted Mrs. Graham with imperturbable gravity. "By that means I hope to save him from one degrading vice at least. I wish I could render the incentives to every other equally innoxious in his case." "But by such means," said I, "you'll never render him virtuous. What is it that constitutes virtue, Mrs. Graham? Is it the circumstance of being willing and able to resist temptation, or that of having no temptations to resist? Is he a strong man that overcomes great obstacles and performs surprising achievements, though by dint of greater muscular exertion, and at the risk of some subsequent fatigue, or he that sits in his chair all day, with nothing to do more laborious than stirring the fire and carrying his food to his mouth? If you would have him walk honorably through the world, you must not attempt to clear the stones from his path, but teach him to walk firmly over them, not insist upon leading him by the hand, but let him learn to go alone." "I will lead him by the hand, Mr. Markham, till he has strength to go alone. And I will clear as many stones from his path as I can, and teach him to avoid the rest, or walk firmly over them, as you say. For when I have done my utmost in the way of clearance, there will still be plenty left to exercise all the agility, steadiness, and circumspection he will ever have. It is all very well to talk about noble resistance, the trials of virtue, but for 50 or 500 men that have yielded to temptation, show me one that has had the virtue to resist. And why should I take it for granted that my son will be 1 in 1,000, and not rather prepare for the worst, and suppose he will be like the rest of mankind, unless I take care to prevent it?" Now, before getting into the discussion proper, with your indulgence I'll read another substantial chunk, this one from Chapter 4, revolving around the conversation with the Venerable Reverend Millward, in which he makes his case for the older version of temperance, that is, moderation, over the abstinence preferred by Helen Graham. And it goes something like this. "I don't take wine, Mrs. Markham," said Mr. Millward, upon the introduction of that beverage. "I'll take a little of your home-brewed ale. I always preferred your home-brewed to anything else." Flattered at this compliment, my mother rang the bell, and a china jug of our best ale was presently brought and set before the worthy gentleman, who so well knew how to appreciate its excellencies. "Now, this is the thing," cried he, pouring out a glass of the same in a long stream, skilfully directed from the jug to the tumbler so as to produce much foam without spilling a drop, and, having surveyed it for a moment opposite the candle, he took a deep draught and then smacked his lips, drew a long breath, and refilled his glass, my mother looking on with the greatest satisfaction. "There's nothing like this, Mrs. Markham," said he. "I always maintain there's nothing to compare to your home-brewed ale." "I'm sure I'm glad you like it, sir. I always look after the brewing myself, as well as the cheese and the butter. I like to have things well done while we're about it." "Quite right, Mrs. Markham." "But then, Mr. Millward, you don't think it wrong to take a little wine now and then, or a little spirits either?" said my mother, as she handed a smoking tumbler of gin and water to Mrs. Wilson, who affirmed that wine sat heavy on her stomach, and whose son Robert was at that moment helping himself to a pretty stiff glass of the same. "By no means," replied the oracle, with a Jove-like nod. "These things are all blessings and mercies, if only we knew how to make use of them. But Mrs. Graham doesn't think so. You shall hear just now what she told us the other day. I told her I'd tell you." And my mother favored the company with a particular account of that lady's mistaken ideas and conduct regarding the matter in hand, concluding with, "Now, don't you think it's wrong?" Wrong, repeated the vicar, with more than common solemnity. Criminal, I should say, criminal. Not only is it making a fool of the boy, but it is despising the gifts of Providence and teaching him to trample them under his feet. He then entered more fully into the question, and explained at large the folly and impiety of such a proceeding. My mother heard him with the profoundest reverence, and even Mrs. Wilson vouchsafed to rest her tongue for a moment, and listened in silence, while she complacently sipped her gin and water. Mr. Lawrence sat with an elbow on the table, carelessly playing with his half-empty wine-glass, and covertly smiling to himself. But don't you think, Mr. Millward, suggested he, when at length the gentleman paused in his discourse, that when a child may be naturally prone to intemperance by the default of its parents or ancestors, for instance, some precautions are advisable? Now, it was generally believed that Mr. Lawrence's father had shortened his days by intemperance. Some precautions it may be, but temperance, sir, is one thing, and abstinence another. But I have heard that with some persons temperance, that is, moderation, is almost impossible, and if abstinence be an evil, which some have doubted, no one will deny that excess is greater. Some parents have entirely prohibited their children from tasting intoxicating liquors, but a parent's authority cannot last forever. Children are naturally prone to hanker after forbidden things, and a child, in any case, would be likely to have a strong curiosity to taste and try the effect of what has been so lauded and enjoyed by others so strictly forbidden to himself, which curiosity would generally be gratified on the first convenient opportunity, and the restraint once broken, serious consequences might ensue. I don't pretend to be a judge of such matters, but it seems to me that this plan of Mrs. Graham's, as you describe it, Mrs. Markham, extraordinary as it may be, is not without its advantages. For here, you see, the child is delivered at once from temptation. He has no secret curiosity, no hankering desire. He is as well acquainted with the tempting liquors as he ever wishes to be, and is thoroughly disgusted by them without having suffered from their effects. And is that right, sir? Have I not proven to you how wrong it is, how contrary to Scripture and to reason, to teach a child to look with contempt and disgust upon the blessings of Providence, instead of to use them aright? You may consider laudanum a blessing of Providence, sir, replied Mr. Lawrence, smiling, and yet you will allow that most of us had better abstain from it, even in moderation. But, added he, I would not desire you to follow out my simile too closely, in witness whereof I finish my glass. Well, there's a lot going on here, isn't there? We'll start with the stuff that most closely corresponds with my reasoning for including these quotations in the lecture. As I mentioned, Helen Graham and the Rev Millward represent the two opposing views regarding the solution to problem drinking that were current in Victorian England. Helen, of course, represents the abstinence model for very good reason. I'm pretty sure you've read far enough into the book now to realize the trauma she's experienced as a result of life with her alcoholic and drug-addicted husband. But to the quaint, sort of busybody-ish, but also really kind of likable and accessible community into which she's moved, her position seems absurd because alcohol is such a daily part of their lives, and they actually can't, I think, understand, can't extend their empathy, maybe, to embrace the extreme of experience that Helen and young Arthur have actually shared, notwithstanding the fact that such experiences as they've had are not terribly uncommon. Millward, on the other hand, is an advocate of the moderation model, the older understanding, the older definition of temperance, and that he couches his endorsement of that position in explicitly religious language is, I think, quite important. Much of the talk about alcohol at the time was coming out of the various denominations, all of whom recognized that rampant alcoholism was a serious problem, but all of whom also sort of fell somewhere on a spectrum between the poles sketched out by Helen and Millward, respectively. Much of the language coming out of, for example, the established church, or I should say the established churches, because this was also the case on this side of the Atlantic, tended to view alcohol as a gift of providence, as an innate good that only became problematic when used poorly. And as Millward says, it's good as long as we know how to use it. He's on very solid ground there in terms of his position relative to the institution he represents. But what follows from his position, of course, is, and I think this is inevitable, the conclusion that if alcohol is accepted as a gift from providence, and if it is abused, the abuse carries with it both a spiritual and a moral condemnation that the emerging addiction model does not saddle the alcoholic or addict with. And I think this becomes apparent with Mr. Lawrence's comment about there being people to whom moderation is legitimately not an option, that there's a genuine inability to moderate intake once intake is begun, which, as I mentioned earlier, does track with contemporary medical research into the area, regardless of what anybody's religious or philosophic positions may have to say about it. Because, of course, where those discourses conflict with the actual evidence, with what the sciences have been able to actually show us, then you've simply identified one of many areas in which they have some catching up to do. And as long as we're on the topic of Lawrence, I'm glad that he brought up the use of laudanum, because now we get into the area of special pleading where intoxicants of choice are concerned, where accepted and unaccepted, where culturally embedded and not so culturally embedded intoxicants come up against each other in public discourse. That is, and I don't want to sound puritanical, because my goodness gracious, I'm not, but when we take a look or take a listen to the arguments people put forward for the use or abstinence, the acceptance or prohibition of various intoxicants, it's really impossible to get around the fact that there's often a great deal of motivated reasoning and special pleading involved. The difficulty that many societies have in dealing with alcohol is that the use of alcohol has become, for long has been actually, ritually important in those societies. And I don't simply mean involved in sacred or formal rituals, but also that it's central to a number of our daily little social and familial rituals, or at least for many people is, and therefore tends not to be looked at merely as a substance, but rather also as a component in those rituals, which is a qualitatively different way of looking at something than simply recognizing that it alters the brain chemistry and therefore needs to be approached with caution. Other ideas worth noting between these two conversations are that, for one thing, there is certainly a gender discourse worked in here, isn't there? The notion that Arthur being raised to dislike alcohol is somehow unmanly is another instance of the way that particular substance is treated in society. It's believed to be masculine to be able to handle your alcohol, and unmasculine, unmanly, not to be able to. So the notion that he's being brought up to have a visceral distaste for it is also bringing him up to be, in Mrs. Markham's words, a milksop, speaks to the difficulty that many people had and continue to have around not so much the biochemical effects of alcohol, which are difficult enough for addicts to deal with, but the social stigma associated with not drinking or not being able to handle one's drink. That is, there are pressures here that really sort of arbitrary social standards bring to bear on what, at the time Bronte was working, was coming to be recognized as quite legitimately a disease. And while there are many other facets of these two conversations that we certainly could explore, the one that I want to conclude with for this slide is the discussion of parenting and the cultivation of virtue in children and the role and limits of the parent. And we'll simply take it as a given that the busybody commentary on someone else's parenting style is going to be unwelcome to any parent who happens to be the object of it. I can say this from experience, it bothers the fuck out of me, and I have very little patience with it. So I'm all in with Helen Graham on this one. That being said, the two basic positions here are that, one, her role is not to make things too easy for her child in order to leave him more capable of handling the difficulties he encounters. This is the position adopted by Gilbert. And two, her position that there are so many pitfalls awaiting her child as he grows that the best thing she can do as a parent is to walk him over all the ones that she can spot so that he can spot them himself, rather than allowing him to simply trip and hurt himself and get back up and brush himself off, as the saying goes. Now here, I'm going to throw in a little bit of a little bit of personal history, because the difference here reminds me very much of the way I was taught to ride a bicycle. And I'm going to criticize my dad here, and this is not something I do often because he is literally the person in my life whom I respect the most. But Dad had no patience for training wheels at all. So his idea of teaching me how to ride a bike was to basically go down to the relatively unused road at the end of our block and run behind the bike pushing me and then let me go and see how far I could get until I fell down. This is in the days before helmets as well. And then eventually I would just stop falling down. Well, it worked, but all my friends who had training wheels learned how to ride a bike without having perpetually scuffed knees. And I think the approach to parenting that Gilbert and Helen are arguing about is largely compatible with the approach to instruction on how to ride a bike that separated, my father from everybody else's father on my block. That is, there are things that you're going to run into that are going to trip you up no matter how much care is taken in preparing you to meet them. And Gilbert's position that one should simply not have training wheels and be allowed to fall is, although enjoying a certain appeal of common sense, and common sense is rarely a good guide to difficult questions, not consistent with the long-term goal of children not getting hurt, but also learning, as children must often learn, in the context of protection, rather than simply being thrown into the deep end, which was another approach to education to which I was subjected as a child. I remember being taken to swimming lessons at the YMCA in Windsor, and the instructor simply, when I didn't want to jump into the water, literally throwing me into the deep end. I didn't know how to swim. This is also more or less what Gilbert is suggesting when he suggests that Helen is making things too easy for Arthur. Her argument is simply, there are enough challenges ahead without introducing unnecessary challenges at home, and the best way to equip one to meet those challenges is to hold the child's hand over the first several encounters so that he or she can learn in the safety of parental protection, so that once that safety is no longer present, they have experience in navigating those hurdles. But as this is not supposed to be a course on Roger's approach to parenting, I think I'll stop talking about that now and these two scenes now, and move on to the final topic that I had in mind for this lecture, which is to get back to Branwell and the image and influence of Branwell, with which I actually began. But what do we say about Branwell? Well, as I've already mentioned, his life, his decline, figures significantly in all three of the Bronte novels that we're discussing. But as I've mentioned that, I don't need to go into it here. You've read or are reading the accounts yourselves. You can draw your own conclusions. What I think I'll do here then, just to wrap this lecture up, is highlight the fact that Branwell also was or had been a very promising artist. He was particularly close with Charlotte, and the two of them sort of took the lead in constructing the first of the make-believe worlds that the Brontes came up with. He had aspirations to be a painter, a writer, a literary critic, but unlike his sisters, became addicted to alcohol at a relatively early age, to a degree that rapidly became incapacitating. He was fired from more than one job for inappropriate or unacceptable conduct, and ended up living at home because, frankly, he had nowhere else to go. He tried for a while to make a living as a portrait painter, and his initial impulses, his initial talents as a painter were pretty good. And the picture you're looking at in this slide is probably the best known picture of the Bronte sisters, and that is Branwell's work. But you can also see that the execution is sloppy. There's something missing there. And what was generally thought of his portraiture was that it was technically not bad, but there was always something missing. And one can't help but wonder, given that by this time in his life he was hopelessly addicted to alcohol and to opium, that whatever abilities he'd had were so severely undermined by his addictions that he could never actually fulfill his promise. There are notes that survive, for example, of him requesting a friend to bring him in the morning 5 shillings worth of gin and drop it off in such a way that his father wouldn't notice that he was receiving it. And records as well of him effectively pleading with the local pharmacist to give him, or sell him rather, some opium. So the guy really was a junkie. And during the last few years of his life, his father actually felt it necessary to sleep in the same room as Branwell because of one night him setting his bedroom on fire and making clear that when he was intoxicated, and he was intoxicated a lot, he couldn't be trusted to be left alone. The fact that his sisters were enjoying what looked like the beginnings of successful careers, that they were living up to their potential and he wasn't, also functioned in his mind as a barrier between them and isolated him further because he was aware of his own failure and their success, and I believe he was jealous of them. There was an incident he had with the wife of an employer with whom he may or may not have had an affair but was certainly in love, and she did seem to reciprocate some of his feelings and some of his intentions. This is one of the jobs from which he was fired. But in any case, when the husband died and she refused to marry him, this also propelled him further into his substance abuse. Because, of course, it's natural for the addict of whatever substance to blame circumstances for the consumption of whatever substance we're discussing. I've seen it happen with alcohol. I've seen it happen with drugs, just in my own life with people I've been close to. It's a common narrative. That's sort of the inner narrative of how addiction works. In any case, Branwell died in 1848. There is a story that he insisted on dying on his feet so that when he knew his death was coming, he struggled to get to his feet and held himself up and remained on his feet until he dropped dead. And there's little question that his addictions played a major role in his demise, although he also seems to have had TB, which was, of course, the family affliction. So a very sad life, and a life reflected in, as I've said, characters in all 3 of the novels we're looking at: John Reed, Hindley Earnshaw, Arthur Huntingdon. And it's for this reason that I've actually included this particular picture, both at the beginning and at the end of the lecture. This is, as I've said, the most famous picture of the Bronte sisters. It's currently hanging in the National Portrait Gallery. But if you take a look at that weird-looking, what almost looks like a pillar of light between Emily in the middle and Charlotte on the right, what you'll actually see is the ghost of Branwell. He had painted all 4 of them together, but was dissatisfied with the image of him, so he painted over it. And this has struck me for a long time, and certainly is striking me now as maybe the best portrait of Branwell that you're likely to find, because the ghost of Branwell, which you see in the image, is also behind, as I said, all of the novels that we're reading and so much of the Bronte sisters' lives. So I'll just leave you with that thought and hope that you found this little bit of a talk worth the wait. And I think that wraps it up for now. My plan for the remainder of the week is to do one more lecture on Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which I will post on Thursday, with Friday being our final tutorial on both Tenant and on the Brontes collectively. Next week, so for the week before March break, we'll be going into our little interlude of our 2-act play of a course by looking at the Pre-Raphaelite movement through the poetry of Christina Rossetti on the one hand, and the only reading I'll have you do is a single poem, Goblin Market, which I know you'll find interesting, and on the other hand, through a discussion of Pre-Raphaelite paintings, which to my eye are among the most interesting and certainly most delightful paintings of the 19th century. So next week there will definitely be a change of pace over both the workload and the material that we've been doing since the beginning of the term. After the break, we'll be moving into Act 2 with our final 2 novels. William Morris's wonderful but sometimes challenging House of the Wolfings, and finally H.G. Wells's Time Machine. So again, a change of pace, which I hope you'll find refreshing. For now, thank you for listening, and for those of you who do show up on Friday, I very much look forward to talking with you. Bye for now.